They say the first empire in human history rose not from peace, but from dust, hunger, and the whisper of gods. It began beneath a sun that scorched the plains of Mesopotamia, a place the ancients called the land between two rivers, where clay tablets recorded not just trade and worship, but ambition. Imagine it, vast, flat horizons, where the Tigris and Euphrates crawled like twin serpents through the cradle of civilization. City-states like Ur, Kish, and Lagash fought endlessly, their kings declaring divine right as temples bled silver and sweat. And then, from the city of Kish, a man appeared. His origins were a mystery carved in legend, born of no noble blood, abandoned in a reed basket, raised by a gardener, and destined for more than servitude. The stories say that goddess Ishtar favored him, that she whispered his name into the winds before he ever drew a blade. Others claim it was ambition alone, cold, human, and relentless, that built his rise. Sargon of Akkad, a name that would one day echo across continents as the first emperor to unite the known world. But before there was unity, there was conquest. Before there was order, there was blood. The city-states of Sumer fell one by one, crushed beneath the precision of Akkadian soldiers, men trained not just to fight, but to think, to build, to govern. With every city Sargon conquered, he left governors instead of ashes, creating something unseen before a web of power stretching from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. Some say he ruled from a city that no one can now find, Agada, a place of gold and cedar, its towers shining brighter than any sun. Others believe it was myth, a phantom capital swallowed by the sands of time. Whatever the truth, the Akkadian Empire was born, a machine of order amidst chaos, ruled by a man who claimed dominion over the world from sunrise to sunset. Yet, as history has shown, every empire begins with the same question: how long can one man's order hold against the entropy of time? Sit back. The story of Akkad is not merely about power. It is about the cost of believing you can master the world. Sargon's empire rose like a storm, swift, precise, unstoppable. Yet, even as the dust of conquest settled, the world began to whisper his name with both awe and fear. To his people, he was the great unifier, the shepherd of Akkad, the one who brought peace through the sword. But to those who watched their temples burn and their kings fall beneath his armies, he was something else, a shadow of ambition that no god could contain. His rule stretched from the Persian Gulf to the distant lands of the Mediterranean, a web of trade, tribute, and control unlike anything seen before. The markets of Akkad overflowed with copper, timber, lapis lazuli, and grain. Messengers carried his decrees across thousands of miles, inscribed on clay and sealed with his name, Zerukin, the true king. But as his dominion grew, so did the silence that followed him. Some tablets describe Sargon as restless, haunted by rebellion. They say the gods themselves turned against him, that his heart grew heavy with the weight of empire. The Sumerian kings who once called themselves divine now plotted in secret, their priests whispering curses against the Akkadian name. Famine struck the land. Rivers ran low. The same earth that had fed the empire began to dry and crack beneath an unrelenting sun. Sargon answered with force, marching again to crush those who defied him. Cities like Ur and Omar fell once more, their people enslaved, their gods stripped from temples and replaced by images of Ishtar, his patron deity. Yet for all his victories, a strange pattern began to form. Rebellion never ceased. It was as if the empire itself resisted the idea of unity. The further Sargon extended his reach, the thinner his control became, like clay stretched too far across a tablet. Still, the old man fought on. He ruled for 55 years, his legend growing darker with each passing decade. Some say that near the end, he wandered his own palaces, talking to walls that no longer answered. Others believe he vanished into the deserts of the West, carried away by the same wind that once brought him power. What remains clear is this: when Sargon died, he left behind more than an empire. He left behind a question that would echo through every ruler after him. Can order ever truly be built on conquest? When Sargon's heart finally stilled, the empire trembled. His sons inherited not peace, but a throne wrapped in whispers and blood. The oldest Ramush took the crown first, a man forged in his father's image, but shadowed by his ghost. The cities Sargon once conquered began to stir again, their loyalty fading like the echo of a drum after battle. Rebellion spread through Sumer, where priests and kings rose in defiance, believing the gods had finally turned their faces away from Akkad. Rumash answered, the only way he knew how, with fire and sword. Records carved in stone speak of 21 cities crushed beneath his march. Temples burned. Rivers ran red. The Akkadian army, the most disciplined the world had ever seen, moved like a living machine, restoring what they called the order of the king. But Ramosha's victories came at a cost. The more he conquered, the less he ruled. The empire, stretched thin and weary, began to fracture in ways no soldier could repair. Some say Ramosh grew paranoid, convinced that betrayal hid in every shadow. Others claim his reign ended not by rebellion, but by poison, a cup handed to him by those closest to his throne. His brother Manishtushu then rose in his place, inheriting not an empire, but a wound. Manishtushu sought to restore balance through trade rather than conquest. He reached beyond the old borders of Akkad, sending merchants and fleets to distant lands, Elam, Dilmun, Magan, gold, copper, and stone flowed into the empire once more, and for a moment, it seemed as if Sargon's vision might endure. Yet even in prosperity, danger lingered. Manishtushu's efforts to centralize power, to claim lands and wealth for the throne, earned him silent enemies among his own governors. The Akkadian kings ruled not by divine blood, but by force, and force alone. One night, the king was ambushed by his own court. The records are vague, but the message is clear. The empire devoured its own. His death marked the end of Sargon's lineage of strength, and the beginning of its slow unraveling. From the throne of Akkad, only one successor remained, Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson. He would rise as the most powerful, and perhaps the most cursed, of them all. For under his reign, Akkad would reach its greatest glory, and face the wrath of the gods themselves. Asterisk, when Naram-Sin ascended the throne, the empire was scarred but alive, a weary beast still clinging to its strength. The grandson of Sargon carried not only the blood of a conqueror, but the weight of an entire civilization's expectation, and unlike those before him, he did not bow to the gods. He declared himself divine. His name, beloved of sin, was carved into the mountains, etched into stone seals, and sung in temples across Mesopotamia. But his declaration of godhood was more than arrogance. It was a defiance of the natural order, a challenge to the heavens themselves. Under Naram-Sin, Akkad surged back to life. The empire reached from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, a stretch of land so vast it was said no messenger could cross it before a new moon rose. He crushed the Lullaby, a fierce mountain people who dared defy Akkad's might, and celebrated his victory by carving his triumph into living rock, the stele of Naram-Sin. On that stone, the king is not a man, but a god ascending a sacred mountain, his soldiers following him like shadows. The defeated kneel beneath his feet as he raises his spear toward the stars. It is one of the earliest depictions of a mortal claiming divinity, a symbol of both greatness and blasphemy. But every empire that climbs too high eventually meets the silence that waits above the clouds. The people began to whisper that Naram-Sin's pride angered the gods. Droughts spread across the land. Crops withered. Rivers withdrew into the earth. Cities that once overflowed with trade and tribute became hollow and starved. Then came the Gutians' fierce tribes from the eastern mountains, descending like a storm with no warning. They did not conquer with strategy, but with chaos, cutting through Akkadian settlements until the empire's roads themselves seemed to vanish. Beneath dust and ruin, some chronicles claim Naram-Sin fell in battle. Others say he lived long enough to see the temples of Akkad burned and the idols of his own divinity smashed. But his name did not die with him. For centuries after, scribes told of his fall as a warning of the king who defied the gods, and the gods who answered not with thunder, but silence. The empire had reached its peak, and now it began to crumble. When the dust of Naram-Sin's empire finally settled, the silence that followed was no gentle peace. It was a haunting punishment. Clay tablets recovered from ancient ruins tell a chilling story. One the ancients called the Curse of Akkad. It speaks of a king who defied the gods, of a city once gleaming with gold now left to the merciless winds. The tale begins with pride. Naram-Sin, convinced of his own divinity, ignored the portents in the sky. Temples emptied, priests' chants fell silent. When drought arrived and the harvest failed, his offerings went unanswered. And then, in a moment of rage or despair, no one can say which, he committed the unthinkable. He stormed the temple of Enlil, the father of gods, and shattered it. From that instant, legend says, Akkad was doomed. Enlil withdrew his favor, and the divine breath that had animated the empire vanished. Crops turned to dust. Rivers that once swelled with life ran shallow and bitter. Merchants, who had filled the roads with clamor, disappeared into the sands. The Gutians, fierce warriors from the mountains, descended on the weakened land, leaving fire and ruin in their wake. Yet it was not the Gutians alone who ended Akkad. It was hunger, fear, and the oppressive weight of divine silence. Centuries later, archaeologists would label the story myth, a poetic attempt to explain ecological collapse. Layers of dried soil indicate a prolonged drought, lasting decades. Others propose that trade routes failed, or that internal rebellions tore the empire apart from within. Even scholars, when discussing Akkad's fall, speak with a kind of reverence, as though some unseen force guided its demise. In the tablets, voices cry out. The fields gave no grain, the womb gave no child, and the eyes of the people saw only despair. Akkad, once Mesopotamia's shining jewel, vanished almost as swiftly as it rose. Palaces were buried, its language faded into dust, and the gods fell silent. Yet curses are rarely endings, they echo, and from the ruins of Akkad, something extraordinary endured, its words. The Akkadian language, carved in cuneiform's wedge-shaped script, carried the empire's memory forward. The body of Akkad was gone, yet its voice remained. Long after the walls crumbled and the bronze and stone of palaces turned to dust, The language of Akkad echoed across Mesopotamian valleys. Though the Akkadians lost their empire, they left humanity something far grander than conquest, a language that would speak for kings, gods, and scribes for nearly 2 millennia. Born from Sumerian roots and Semitic breath, Akkadian became the bridge of civilization, the voice of law, literature, and diplomacy in the ancient world. In temples and libraries, clay tablets recorded life's rhythm, from hymns of gods to farmers' calculations. If language is the soul of a people, then Akkad's soul did not perish, it transformed. As spoken Sumerian faded, Akkadian scribes preserved it, turning it into the sacred tongue of scholars. Bilingual texts flourished, Sumerian and Akkadian written side by side, preserving knowledge of 2 entwined worlds. This union became a sprachbend, a living fusion that blurred nations' boundaries. The result was connection, not merely communication. Even as Akkad vanished from maps, its words spread like seeds. From Babylon to Assyria, empires carried Akkad's voice in laws, prayers, and stories. Among scribes, one name shone brighter than any king's: Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, priestess of yore, the first author in human history. Her hymns to Inanna pulsed with rare emotion. She wrote of devotion, exile, and the loneliness of serving both God and empire. Through her, Akkad's spirit found rhythm, not through war, but words. Her voice was divine yet human, filled with loyalty and loss. She transformed cuneiform from a ledger of trade into a vessel of art, emotion, and prayer. Centuries passed, but her words outlived kings, cities, and empires. Akkad's language became immortal, etched into clay and memory alike. In dim temple lamplight, cedar smoke mingling with distant chants, Enheduanna sat before wet clay. Her stylus moved like a whisper, carving eternity. Daughter of Sargon, her power stemmed not from sword or throne, but voice. As high priestess of Nana, at yore around 2300 BC, she bridged mortals and gods. While kings learned the language of rule, Enheduanna already shaped the language of the soul. Her hymns bled with feeling, the exaltation of Inanna, Inin, Segura. Temple hymns. For the first time, humanity spoke in first person. I, Enheduanna, she wrote. She chronicled suffering, devotion, rebellion, and hope. In exile, cast from her temple by the rebel Lugalan, she pleaded with gods, hear me, restore my name, lift me from disgrace. Scholars today hear something hauntingly modern, a woman stripped of power but unbroken. In her poetry, Inanna, goddess of love and war, is both destroyer and savior, beauty intertwined with rage. Some believe Enheduanna saw herself in Inanna, human, not divine, caught between duty and desire. She gave the goddess a heart, and through her, humanity a voice. Cuneiform tablets bearing her words were never meant to last, yet they endure. Each wedge-shaped mark holds her breath. Each line pulses from 4 millennia ago. She did not conquer lands. She conquered silence. Through her, Akkad became an empire of words, not just stone and bronze. Imagine kings walking not merely as rulers, but as living gods, bending air with presence. This was Akkad under Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, whose ambition blurred mortal and divine. Statues show him larger than life, gazing over subjects, eyes wide with awe or fear. Contemporary texts call him Lord of the 4 quarters of the earth, a weighty cosmic title. He claimed divinity in life, seated in temples built in his honor, worshipped while alive. Victories carved into stone on the victory stele of Naram-Sin show soldiers in relentless precision, mountains trembling under armies, captives falling beneath spears. The stele is more than record. It is a warning etched in stone. Power is sacred, terrifying. Naram-Sin's reign also featured meticulous governance, daughters as high priestesses, sons as governors, marriages tying distant city-states to his empire building through bloodlines as much as battle. Yet divine aura could not mask fragility. Clay tablets whisper of rebellion, provinces resisting Akkadian rule, unrest simmering. Scholars suggest that even as Naram-Sin was worshipped as god, foundations of empire were cracking. Divinity served control. Belief in God-King made law unquestioned, commands absolute. Temples, seals, inscriptions reinforced reality. But divinity is double-edged. Awe inspires fear, resentment, rebellion. As armies expanded from Persian Gulf to Mediterranean, empires seemed unstoppable. Yet seeds of decline were sown, hidden in structures that made Akkad mighty. One question remains as echoes of chisel and hammer fade. Can gods govern men, or does hubris ensure even divine kings must fall? Beneath the awe-inspiring image of Akkadian divinity and military might lay a far more fragile reality, one that few could see from the gilded palaces of Akkad. The empire was vast, stretching from the lower sea near the Persian Gulf to the upper sea, the distant Mediterranean. And yet this expanse was stitched together not only by armies, but by the delicate balance of water, food, and loyalty. Rivers were lifelines. The Tigris and Euphrates carried the promise of sustenance, but also the threat of famine if mismanaged. Farmers labored under the watchful eyes of temple administrators, irrigating fields, maintaining canals, and collecting taxes in grain, wool, and livestock. Nomadic Amorites roamed the peripheries, herding flocks that could devastate farmland if tensions flared, creating an ever-present risk of conflict. The southern plains of Iraq were fertile but volatile, where a single season of unpredictable floods could topple harvests, starve cities, and send populations fleeing toward more secure lands. In the north, rain-fed agriculture was no less precarious, dependent on seasonal patterns that could shift without warning. Akkadian rulers attempted to weave all these threads into a cohesive system, employing local governors, appointing tax collectors, and even establishing massive defensive walls, like the repeller of the Amorites, to separate pastoralists from farmland. These strategies reveal an empire constantly negotiating with nature and people alike, a balancing act on the knife edge of survival. Some historians argue that it was this very dependency on fragile systems, both human and environmental, that set the stage for the empire's eventual unraveling. Trade became another crucial lifeline, stretching across deserts and mountains to bring timber, copper, and silver into the heart of Akkad. Merchants carried exotic goods from Magan, Dilmun, and even the distant lands of believed to be the Indus Valley, bringing both wealth and new pressures to govern far-flung supply lines. Meanwhile, the Akkadian administration relied heavily on visual propaganda, cylinder seals, statues, and inscriptions to project control. Yet these symbolic gestures could not fully replace effective oversight or ensure loyalty across such vast lands. As we peer closer into the reality of Akkadian rule, the picture emerges of an empire that dazzled the senses, projected divine authority, and commanded fear, yet teetered perpetually on the edge of collapse. It is in this tension between grandeur and fragility, divinity and mortality, abundance and scarcity, that we begin to sense the true mystery of Akkad, how a civilization so powerful could unravel, leaving echoes in stone and clay, whispers of kings and gods, and questions that linger over the shifting sands of Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire was not only a story of conquest and administration, but also of ambition that reached into the realm of the divine, where kings did not merely rule, but were proclaimed gods on earth. Sargon of Akkad, whose name would echo through millennia, established a precedent for power that intertwined the mortal and the sacred, presenting himself as the chosen of the gods, a man who could claim authority over the lands from sunrise to sunset. Yet it was his grandson, Naram-Sin, who pushed this fusion of kingship and divinity to its zenith, elevating himself not only above mortals but above the priests who had traditionally mediated between heaven and earth. Naram-Sin's statues and reliefs depict a figure of enormous scale, larger than his soldiers, larger than the cities themselves, towering over captives and distant landscapes, his horned helmet marking him unmistakably as divine. His military campaigns were celebrated not just as victories, but as acts of cosmic significance, positioning him as an executor of the god's will, a ruler whose authority was unquestionable. Inscriptions boast of campaigns across mountains and rivers, of cities destroyed and walls shattered. Yet behind these proclamations lies the complexity of sustaining an empire where divine status had to be constantly reinforced by ritual, ceremony, and sheer spectacle. Priests and officials were strategically appointed, daughters married to distant rulers, sons placed in provincial centers, each move both political and symbolic, ensuring that the illusion of divinity was backed by the machinery of governance. Some researchers suggest that this divine kingship may have been a response to the constant threats of rebellion and environmental instability, a way to inspire obedience and awe in the face of uncertainty. Yet it also sowed seeds of tension. When rulers were seen as gods, their failures could not be excused, and natural disasters, famine, or rebellion were interpreted as omens of divine disfavor, magnifying the stakes of every decision. The Akkadian seals, inscriptions, and monumental sculptures serve as both propaganda and confession, telling us not only what the rulers wanted to be seen, but hinting at the pressures, anxieties, and human ambitions that accompanied such exalted status. As we consider the god-kings of Akkad, we are left to wonder, did their claimed divinity protect the empire? Or did it make their fall all the more spectacular, a reminder that even gods, in the imagination of mortals, can be toppled, leaving only echoes carved in stone and whispered in the winds that sweep across the ruins of one's mighty cities? The Akkadian Empire, for all its grandeur and divine kings, was not immune to the slow, creeping forces that would eventually unravel it. A tapestry of conquest fraying at the edges under pressures both human and natural. By the time of Shaka-Lashari's reign, cracks had begun to form in the empire's foundations, subtle at first, almost imperceptible beneath the clamor of military triumphs and ceremonial splendor, for kings would follow in rapid succession, their names barely remembered, reigning for mere years as though the gods themselves had loosened their grip on mortal authority. Some suggest that the administrative reach of Akkad had overextended itself, that city-states long accustomed to autonomy resisted the demands of distant governors and officials. Others point to environmental catastrophe, a series of droughts and shifting weather patterns that gradually turned once fertile lands into parched plains. Excavations at sites like Tel Leland and Tel Brock reveal layers of wind-blown sand, desiccated fields, and skeleton-thin livestock, painting a vivid, almost tactile picture of famine gripping the heart of Mesopotamia. The upper country, that vital source of rain-fed agriculture, faltered under relentless dryness, cutting off the southern cities from the grain and resources that had underwritten Akkadian dominance. Nomadic groups, sensing opportunity, moved herds into contested fields, igniting conflicts that the empire's military struggled to contain. Some researchers propose that these pressures coincided with the infamous 4.2 kiloyear event, a sudden global-scale drought that may have triggered societal collapses across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Yet other evidence complicates the picture. Tel Brock remained partially occupied, administrative systems persisted, and trade did not vanish overnight, suggesting a more nuanced decline where environmental stress intersected with political fragility. The Gutians rising from the north exploited this fragility. Moving into territories that Akkad had once claimed, their rule remembered as chaotic, with little regard for the agriculture records or city life that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for centuries. Coins, inscriptions, and artifacts tell fragmented stories, hinting at sudden upheaval, but leaving questions. Was it drought, political mismanagement, rebellion, or a combination of all three that toppled one of the world's first empires? And as the dust settled over abandoned cities, as grain stores dwindled and walls crumbled, a shadow lingered, a silence in the once bustling streets, waiting for the next power to rise from the ruins and attempt again to claim the legacy of Akkad. After the decline of Akkad, the region slipped into what some call a dark age, a period shrouded in obscurity and disorder, where the names of rulers blur and the pulse of civilization seems to falter. The Gutians, a people from the north, filled the vacuum left by Akkad's unraveling. Their presence recorded more in chaos than in the triumphs of kings. Cuneiform sources portray them as uncaring stewards of the lands they conquered, allowing livestock to roam freely, failing to maintain irrigation, and triggering famine and instability across Mesopotamia. Scholars debate whether this depiction is accurate, or whether it reflects the bias of later Sumerian scribes seeking to contrast their own order with the perceived barbarism of these northern rulers. The Sumerian king list provides a dizzying roll call of Gutian kings, 21 in total, whose reigns were brief and often overlapping, spanning a mere 91 years. Names like Imhotep, Shulm, and Elulumesh flicker across history, yet evidence outside of textual mentions is almost non-existent. Archaeology hints at continued urban life during this period, but the rhythm of bureaucratic control, central taxation, and organized irrigation seems to have faltered. Some researchers suggest that the Gutian period may have represented a decentralization rather than outright collapse, with power reverting to local city-states that had been under Akkad's tight grip. Meanwhile, famine and social unrest forced populations to migrate toward more fertile regions, leading to population contraction in key northern cities. Others theorize that this period of disruption created conditions for new cultural synthesis, as displaced peoples, local rulers, and migrating nomads like the Amorites interacted in contested landscapes. The Ur III dynasty would eventually rise from this interlude, restoring a semblance of central authority. But the shadow of Akkad's collapse lingered, a cautionary tale of imperial overreach, environmental vulnerability, and the fragility of human organization. It is within this murky interval where written records are sparse and archaeology is fragmentary. That the mystery of the Gutians persists, leaving historians to reconstruct their story from whispers in clay tablets, ruined walls, and the occasional seal. How much of their reputation for disorder was real, and how much was shaped by the victors who wrote the history that survives? As we peer into the silent streets and abandoned fields of this time, the question remains, could the empire have endured, or was its fall inevitable under the combined weight of drought, rebellion, and human ambition? The collapse of the Akkadian Empire has long been entangled with whispers of the natural world, a reminder that even the mightiest human creations are vulnerable to the forces of earth and sky. Some researchers point to a prolonged and catastrophic drought, part of what climatologists now call the 4.2 kiloyear event, as a crucial factor in the empire's downfall. Imagine the Tigris and Euphrates, once reliable lifelines, reduced to sluggish streams under an unrelenting sun, their waters falling 1.5 meters below previous levels, leaving irrigation channels cracked and fields parched. Archaeological sites like Tel Lelan reveal the aftermath of this climatic strain: abandoned walls, desolate streets, wind-blown sand choking what had once been thriving granaries. Skeleton-thin livestock testify to a famine that spared neither human nor beast, while tens of thousands of inhabitants were forced to migrate in search of water and fertile soil. Some evidence suggests that northern rain-fed agriculture, critical for feeding southern cities, collapsed in tandem, cutting off essential food supplies and creating a cascading economic crisis. The Amorites and other nomadic groups, driven by desperation, encroached upon cultivated lands, clashing with farmers and authorities, further destabilizing the region. Yet, interpretations vary. Critics like Richard Zettler caution that the chronological evidence is sparse, and that some accounts of famine may have been exaggerated or symbolic in Akkadian texts. Others suggest that the empire, already strained by political fragmentation, may have been unable to absorb environmental shocks, meaning the drought acted more as a catalyst than a primary cause. Soil analysis, fossil corals from Oman, and computer simulations of ancient climate patterns hint at prolonged chamal winds, rising salinity in irrigated fields, and diminishing crop yields, painting a vivid picture of environmental pressure suffocating a civilization. What becomes clear is that Akkad's decline cannot be seen solely through the lens of conquest or rebellion. It was also a struggle against a shifting climate, an invisible adversary that rendered canals useless, fields barren, and cities vulnerable. In this dance of human ambition and natural constraint, one is left to wonder, did the rulers of Akkad underestimate the power of the climate? Or were they simply unable to marshal resources in time to resist its quiet, inexorable force? As the empire faltered, the stage was set for a new order. Yet the desert winds whispered that no kingdom, however vast, is impervious to the rhythms of the earth after the fall of Akkad. A shadow settled over Mesopotamia, a period often described in later texts as chaotic and obscure. The Gutians, a mysterious group from the Zagros Mountains, emerged as the dominant power, yet little is known about their reign or governance. Imagine city streets emptied of the order once imposed by Akkadian kings, granaries left untended, and animals wandering freely through abandoned fields. Contemporary sources paint the Gutians as indifferent rulers, unconcerned with the meticulous agricultural systems or bureaucratic records that had sustained Akkad, the Sumerian king. List recounts a rapid succession of rulers' names like Imta, Sholm and Alulamesh, flickering across history with reigns measured in mere years, suggesting political instability so profound that continuity was nearly impossible. Some historians speculate that the Gushan period may have lasted close to a century, yet archaeological evidence is sparse, leaving gaps filled by conjecture and interpretation. Scholars debate whether the Gushans imposed strict control over the Sumerian cities or merely acted as opportunistic overseers, exploiting the remnants of Akkadian infrastructure for their own ends. Records hint at a disruption of trade, as merchants and artisans struggled to maintain networks once supported by centralized Akkadian authority. Meanwhile, famine likely stalked the countryside, exacerbated by neglect of irrigation canals and the unpredictability of seasonal rains. Yet, there is a paradox in this era. While some accounts depict chaos and desolation, evidence at sites like Uruk suggests continued occupation and some functioning governance. Perhaps local elites adapted, asserting control over limited territories. Or perhaps the Gushans' power was exercised more through intimidation than administration. Regardless, the narrative of Akkad's successors is one of decline and fragmentation, a reminder that empires, no matter how grand, are fragile when faced with the dual pressures of internal weakness and external disruption. And yet, the story does not end here. From this apparent darkness, new rulers would rise, restoring some semblance of order and setting the stage for the revival of Sumerian civilization. The question lingers in the windswept ruins and clay tablets, who truly held power during this shadowed century, and how much of Akkad's knowledge, wealth, and influence survived the Gushan interlude. From one mystery to the next, we move toward the resurgence of the Sumerians, and the echoes of Akkad's legacy that would shape the generations to come. Asterisk. Imagine the land itself turning against its people, the rivers that had fed Akkad dwindling to uncertain trickles, and fertile fields cracking under relentless sun. Some researchers believe that the fall of the Akkadian Empire was not merely a story of kings, conquest, or rebellion, but of a profound environmental catastrophe. Around 2200 BC, a period known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, the climate of the Near East shifted dramatically. Evidence from Tel Leland and Tel Brock suggests that sudden aridity and increasingly violent windstorms devastated once thriving cities. Fields that had yielded grain enough to sustain armies and feed dense urban populations failed. Archaeologists discovered skeleton-thin sheep and cattle, abandoned homes, and layers of wind-blown sand, silent witnesses to a desperate population fleeing to find water elsewhere. Harvey Weiss and other climatologists argue that this abrupt drought was compounded by volcanic activity, triggering a cascade of agricultural collapse across northern Mesopotamia. Water levels in the Tigris and Euphrates dropped more than a meter below previous norms, straining irrigation networks and fracturing the delicate balance between farmers and nomadic herders. Some historians note that the pastoral Amorites, displaced by drying pastures, encroached on farmland, sparking conflicts that further destabilized the region. Peter Domenical has suggested that broader oscillations in the North Atlantic climate might have influenced river flows, linking Akkad's decline to global environmental patterns. Hokkaido University researchers later pointed to prolonged winter chamois winds, which brought salinization to irrigated fields in southern Mesopotamia, creating famine and threatening the very survival of cities. Yet, not all scholars agree on the scale or singularity of this climatic explanation. Richard Zutler warns that the chronological uncertainties of AKD make it difficult to attribute collapse solely to drought. and Joan Oates notes that Tel Brock continued to function after the so-called Brock event, implying resilience in some sectors. Still, the idea that nature itself can challenge empires, reshaping civilizations without a sword or siege, casts a shadow over our understanding of Akkad. It is a stark reminder that even the mightiest rulers, the most sophisticated administrations, and the richest cities remain vulnerable to the silent, inexorable power of the environment. And so, as we consider the ruins of once glorious Akkad, we must ask, was it human ambition, divine wrath, or the slow hand of climate that finally brought the empire to its knees? From one mystery to the next, we move into the world of Akkadian governance and the subtle strategies that kept their empire together before the collapse. Beneath the grandeur of Akkad's conquests lay a system of governance so intricate that it held a vast, diverse empire together for generations. Sargon, the empire's architect, understood that brute force alone could never sustain control over lands, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. What he built instead was a structure of loyalty, surveillance, and administration that echoed through millennia of imperial rule. At the heart of this system were the NCI or governors, chosen not by local nobility but appointed directly by the king himself. These officials, often Akkadian by birth, ruled over conquered Sumerian cities, ensuring taxes, labor, and tribute flowed unbroken to the capital. Their loyalty was maintained through a delicate mix of privilege and fear. Clay tablets discovered in sites like Mari and Ebla revealed detailed records lists of grain rations, temple offerings, and military quotas, all inscribed in the cuneiform script that bound the empire through language and bureaucracy. The king's decrees were transmitted by scribes, those quiet figures who turned clay into instruments of control. Each shipment of copper, barley, or soldiers was accounted for. Every temple, priest, and local leader was known by name to Akkad's central authority. Yet within this tight control lay the seeds of fragility. As the empire expanded, so too did the complexity of its system. Roads that once connected the empire began to crumble, and messages carried by couriers took longer to arrive. Some governors grew ambitious, their loyalty wavering in the absence of the king's shadow. Sargon's successors Rimush and Manishtush faced internal revolts from these very administrators, struggling to keep the machinery of power from grinding itself into chaos. Still, the genius of Akkadian governance persisted. Even the empires that followed the Babylonians, the Assyrians would mirror its model, refining and expanding upon the foundation Sargon had laid. The empire was more than its armies. It was an organism of order, maintained by written law and ritualized obedience. Yet one must wonder, as the drought deepened and faith in leadership waned, whether the people of Akkad still believed in the divine mandate that held their world together. Could the structure that once embodied stability now become the instrument of its own undoing? Next, we step into the heart of that belief, the divine authority that crowned kings and shaped destinies in the shadowed temples of Akkad in Akkad. The line between man and God was deliberately blurred, and the king was the living embodiment of divine authority, a bridge between the mortal world and the capricious whims of the gods. Sargon had begun this transformation, claiming the favor of Enlil and Anu, but it was his grandson, Naram-Sin, who elevated the principle to unprecedented heights. Naram-Sin did not merely rule under the watchful eyes of deities. He proclaimed himself a god on earth, wearing the horned crown of divinity and demanding worship alongside temples and priests. His statues towered over citizens, larger-than-life figures meant to inspire awe and obedience. reminding everyone that they were subject to a ruler who could claim the power of the heavens. Reliefs such as the victory stele of Naram-Sin depict the king ascending mountains, trampling enemies while divine symbols hover above, blessing his conquests, an unmistakable visual language that fused military triumph with sacred sanction. But this divine authority carried its own peril. By elevating himself above the gods, Naram-Sin set a standard that later kings struggled to meet, creating tension between human ambition and religious expectation. The temples, once independent centers of spiritual and economic power, now became extensions of royal authority. High priests and priestesses administered the rituals that legitimized kingship, often family members strategically placed to secure loyalty and maintain a cosmic order. Enheduanna, Sargon's daughter, exemplifies this dynamic, blending her priestly duties with literary genius to celebrate the divine right of her father and cement his memory through hymns. These hymns were more than poetry, they were instruments of power, echoing in temple walls, invoking gods to witness the king's supremacy, and framing history through divine perspective. The people, however, were not passive. Their devotion was enforced through awe, fear, and spectacle. Festivals, processions, and monumental architecture all reinforced the notion that the king's will was both earthly law and celestial decree. Yet, as with all human constructs, divine kingship carried vulnerability. When the climate shifted, crops failed, and rebellions stirred, the illusion of invincible godhood began to falter, revealing the delicate interplay between ideology and reality. What happens when the gods no longer seem to protect their chosen ruler? From the zenith of divine authority, we now descend into the harsh realities that tested Akkadian famine, the upheaval and the slow erosion of empire from within. To truly grasp the ascent and unraveling of Akkad, one must attune to the subtle rhythms of its landscape, the steady pulse of its rivers, and the precarious heartbeat of its economy. The empire flourished on a delicate equilibrium between the irrigated plains of southern Mesopotamia and the rain-fed fields of the north, each region dependent upon the other in a finely tuned network. In the south, the Tigris and Euphrates carved their courses with seeming predictability, yet even the slightest deviation could devastate harvests. Fields that once returned 30 grains for every seed now risked salinization, forcing farmers to innovate or abandon their lands. The northern upper country offered a measure of relief, its sporadic rains feeding crops exported southward, but these lands were increasingly exposed to drought, wind, erosion, and incursions by nomadic groups. The Akkadian kings recognized that survival demanded more than military prowess. It required careful stewardship of resources, meticulous records, and coordinated labor across vast distances. During the dry months, farmers became soldiers, constructing canals, repairing dikes, and fortifying cities. A seasonal cycle intertwining agriculture, military duty, and civic responsibility into an unbroken rhythm. Trade was equally essential. Metals from distant mountains, timber from Lebanon, copper from Megan, and luxury items from Dilmun and Maluha flowed into Akkad, sustaining artisans, temples, and administrators. Ships moored at the quay of Agada, brimming with exotic cargo, formed a complex web of influence connecting the heart of the empire to far-flung regions. Yet prosperity was never guaranteed. Droughts, receding rivers, and the demands of feeding a growing population created tension between nomads and settled farmers, between northern and southern territories. Grain prices could spike, herders might raid crops, and famine lurked always at the edge of imagination. Akkad's wealth was both shield and sword, enabling kings to project power while rendering the system exquisitely sensitive to environmental disruption. As northern fields dried and rivers fell, the intricate dance sustaining Akkad faltered. The king's authority, once reinforced by divine sanction and economic abundance, faced a test no army could confront. From bustling marketplaces to furrowed fields, the heartbeat of Akkad faltered, each missed harvest, each dispute over water, and grain foreshadowing the empire's slow unraveling civilization, whose very survival hinged on the delicate balance of nature and human ingenuity. To envision Akkad is to picture not merely its cities and fields, but the vast networks of rivers, seas, and distant lands that extended its reach far beyond Mesopotamia. Sargon and his successors understood that power rested not solely on armies and fertile soil, but on controlling scarce resources and far-reaching trade. Timber from Lebanon cedars, silver from distant mountains, copper from Megan, and shells from Dilmun were carried across deserts and seas, connecting the empire to lands most citizens would never see. Meluhha, likely the Indus Valley, appears in records as a source of exotic goods, from gemstones to intricately carved seals, hinting at a trade network spanning thousands of kilometers. Some scholars argue that references to ships from Meluhha docking at Agada suggest a sophistication in maritime navigation previously underestimated, with Akkadians establishing coastal posts and negotiating with foreign rulers. These exchanges were more than commerce. They were prestige, influence, and diplomacy long before such words existed. Yet trade was fragile. A failed shipment, a drought in northern lands, or conflict along caravan routes could reverberate across Akkad, sparking famine, unrest, and challenging even the mightiest king's authority. Foreign goods also brought cultural influence, artistic motifs, religious practices, and technological ideas merged into Akkadian society, creating a cosmopolitan vibrancy rare in the ancient world. Cylinder seals, inscriptions boasting Sargon's conquest of the Silver Mountain or the Cedar Forest, and references to Dilmun and Megan reveal a world both expansive and intimate, where each journey carried ambitions, rivalries, and stories. Yet as rivers waned and droughts struck, this web of trade strained. The very network that demonstrated Akkad's reach now exposed its fragility. An empire tied to distant lands was vulnerable to forces beyond its control, and the arteries of commerce hinted at the looming decline that would define Akkad's fall. Step into Akkad's dimly lit temples and palaces, and one enters a realm where power, divinity, and ambition intertwine in stone and metal. Akkadian art was not mere decoration. It was ideology, authority, and a reflection of a civilization attempting to be both mortal and divine. The victory stele of Naram-Sin, carved from pink limestone, depicts the king climbing a mountain, looming over enemies and attendants, God among men. Soldiers and captives are rendered in intense detail, their faces frozen in terror, despair, or obedience, reflecting the fine line between order and chaos. The realism is unsettling yet captivating. Each figure tells a story. Each line records human struggle under divine mandate. Cylinder seals, tiny yet intricate, depict gods, mythic creatures, hunts, and rituals with astonishing precision. The Seal of Ada, for example, compresses a narrative into a few centimeters. The hunting god draws his bow, Ishtar rises armed, Shamash emerges as sun god, and the Zubird of destiny hovers a tableau rich with layered meaning. These images were ideological tools, reinforcing hierarchy, devotion, and royal authority. Sculpture advanced similarly, as in the Basetki statue and the Manishtushu figure, blending naturalism with grandeur, faces individualized, muscles defined, garments detailed, yet scale and posture communicate power and divine favor. Enheduanna's influence extended beyond the visual. Her hymns merged literary skill with political intent, praising Inanna while legitimizing her father Sargon's rule, entwining religion, politics, and personal voice, shaping literature for centuries. In all these works, one senses a civilization obsessed with control over humans, nature, and the divine. Yet beneath the polished surfaces lies tension, a society aware of its fragility, susceptible to weather, rebellion, and human frailty. Akkadian art is beautiful, commanding, and ominous, mirroring an empire at its zenith, projecting strength while hinting at the uncertainties that would eventually erode it. The question persists, in a civilization so intent on power, what truths lie hidden within its art, waiting to reveal the secrets of its eventual decline? In the Akkadian Empire, the boundary between the mortal and the divine was porous, almost imperceptible, as kings and gods shared the same narrative. Stage. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, elevated this relationship to unprecedented heights, declaring himself a living deity worshipped in temples that once were reserved for the gods alone. His image, colossal and commanding, towered above mortals, his horned helmet a visual proclamation of divinity. Temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of administration, economy, and cosmic order. The priests, scribes, and high priestesses acted as intermediaries between human ambition and divine will, ensuring that every harvest, battle, and law fell under sacred sanction. Enheduanna, as high priestess of yore, embodied this connection. Her hymns, not merely poetry, but a fusion of liturgy and politics. She invoked Inanna as a force of both fertility and war, describing her as a great storm bird, swooping upon lesser gods and humankind alike, uniting terror and reverence in a single image. These myths were not static. They evolved, borrowing Sumerian themes, yet adapting them to Akkadian sensibilities, embedding messages of loyalty, cosmic balance, and divine legitimacy into the very fabric of society. On seals and statues, deities like Ea Ishtar, Shamash, and the enigmatic zoo bird were depicted in narratives that conveyed both protection and judgment, signaling the omnipresence of divine authority. Rituals intertwined with governance, from offerings to sacred animals to ceremonial hunts, reinforcing that the king's power was a reflection of the god's will. Yet for all its grandeur, Akkadian religion reveals a subtle anxiety, a preoccupation with the precariousness of human order. Stories speak of famine, rebellion, and divine wrath, echoing real societal stresses like droughts or invasions. Every carving, hymn, and inscription becomes a conversation with uncertainty, a human attempt to anchor ephemeral power within the immutable logic of the divine. It is a religion that elevates kings, yet constantly reminds them of mortality, of forces unseen but deeply felt. In this intertwining of myth, politics, and personal devotion, we see a civilization striving to control both fate and history, using the gods as witnesses to their ambition. And yet, one must wonder, when the Akkadian kings claimed the heavens as their throne, did they foresee the storm gathering at the edges of their empire? ready to sweep away their divine claims and leave only echoes in stone and clay. The visual culture of Akkad emerges like a window into a world both vivid and ominous, where power, divinity, and mortality are carved into stone and metal with astonishing skill. Unlike the rigid stylization of earlier Sumerian art, Akkadian sculpture and reliefs embraced a realism that captured tension, motion, and emotion with unprecedented intensity. Look at the victory stele of Naram-Sin, for instance. The king ascends a mountain, larger than life, trampling his enemies beneath him, while the vanquished writhe in terror, their expressions frozen in stone. Here, scale communicates hierarchy, yes, but also narrative. The drama of conquest, the triumph of order over chaos, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. Cylinder seals, once simple tools for identification, became canvases for storytelling, depicting hunting scenes, mythological creatures, and deities with intricate detail. Ada, the scribe, appears on seals alongside armed gods, sun deities, and the enigmatic zoo bird, all rendered with a sharp eye for proportion and gesture. Statues like the Pasetki figure or the Manishchu statue show the Akkadian fascination with individuality, with subtle musculature, posture, and facial expression conveying personality and intent. Even materials tell a story. Lead, copper, and other metals were shaped with lost wax techniques, revealing the extraordinary craftsmanship and technological knowledge of Akkadian artisans. Art was never merely decorative. It was ideological, a statement of authority, piety, and cultural identity. It communicated the king's divine mandate, the god's influence, and the human drama of war, agriculture, and society. Through these artifacts, we sense the weight of history pressing upon the living, the omnipresence of cosmic forces, and the fragility of human endeavors. Each carving, each engraving, each hammered surface speaks to a society deeply aware of both its mastery and its vulnerability. As we trace the lines of these works, feeling the texture of stone in our imagination, we begin to understand the duality of Akkadian art, beauty entwined with power, realism intertwined with ideology, and above all, the omnipresent reminder that every empire, no matter how monumental, stands beneath the gaze of time and the inscrutable will of the divine. But as these images stare back across millennia, we are left with a question that haunts every observer. What truths did the Akkadians hope to immortalize? And what fears were they attempting to freeze forever in their art? In Akkad, the divine was never distant. It permeated every aspect of life, from the lofty throne of the king to the furrows of the fields where farmers toiled under the unforgiving sun. The kings themselves were elevated to godhood, most famously Naram-Sin, who claimed the title King of the Four Quarters and was worshipped as a living deity. His temples are testament to his semi-divine status. Priests and priestesses, such as Inhejuana, daughter of Sargon, acted as intermediaries, bridging the human and the divine through hymns, rituals, and the careful recitation of sacred texts. The pantheon was vast, and each god commanded distinct powers. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, could bless fertility or unleash destruction. Ea, the water god, held dominion over life-sustaining rivers and hidden knowledge. Shamash, the sun deity, illuminated both the physical and moral worlds, judging kings and commoners alike. Rituals were elaborate and symbolic. Sacrifices, offerings, and the careful placement of votive statues created a rhythm of devotion and obedience, weaving society tightly to the whims of gods. Even art reflected this spiritual hierarchy. Cylinder seals depicted divine assemblies, battles between gods and monsters, or sacred animals entwined with human figures, all emphasizing the permeation of the divine in worldly affairs. Yet there was also an undercurrent of uncertainty and fear. The gods were capricious, punishing human hubris, inciting famine or flood, or bestowing sudden misfortune. Some Akkadian texts hint at cosmic battles, celestial omens, and destinies written in the stars, suggesting that no human action could escape the scrutiny of higher powers. This fusion of politics and religion reinforced authority. The king was both enforcer and devout servant. His campaigns blessed or, perhaps demanded by divine mandate. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, lived in a constant interplay of faith and fear, navigating the unpredictable world with prayers, charms, and ritual observances. Scholars today debate the extent to which Akkadian kings truly believed in their own divinity versus employing it as a tool of political control. But the evidence leaves us with a tantalizing ambiguity. Walk through the ruins of an Akkadian temple in your mind. Imagine the incense curling in the air, the chant of priests echoing off stone walls, and the weight of divine expectation pressing on every shoulder. In such a world, the sacred and the mundane were inseparable, and the line between worship and obedience, reverence and fear, blurred until it vanished. And yet, one question lingers in the shadow of these ancient rituals. Did the Akkadians command the gods, or were they themselves commanded by forces they could never fully comprehend? Akkadian art stands as one of the most striking windows into a civilization that prized both realism and symbolism, a world where every chisel mark, every carved cylinder seal was a narrative frozen in time, speaking of power, divinity, and human ambition. From monumental steles, like the victory stele of Naram-Sin, depicting a god-king towering over vanquished foes, to delicate cylinder seals bearing intricate depictions of deities, animals, and daily life. The Akkadians mastered a visual language that conveyed authority, fear, and awe. The figures in their art are never static. They pulse with movement, gestures meticulously carved to suggest hierarchy, divinity, or struggle. Soldiers advance with weapons poised. Captives cower in submission. Gods loom in exaggerated scale, emphasizing their otherworldly power, and animals, real and mythical, intertwine with humans in scenes of conflict or fertility, revealing a cosmology where the natural and supernatural coexisted. Even the smallest artifacts reveal astonishing detail, inscriptions etched with precision, facial expressions captured with lifelike subtlety, clothing and jewelry rendered with exacting care, as if each line could transmit the texture of silk or the weight of a metal breastplate. Some researchers suggest this intense realism was not merely aesthetic. It reinforced ideology, making kings appear larger than life and gods omnipotent, embedding obedience and reverence in the viewer's mind. Others see a philosophical aspect, where art was a medium for exploring mortality, chaos, and divine favor, a mirror of the precariousness of Akkadian life, where famine, war, and rebellion loomed ever close. Sculpture was not limited to stone. Metalworking, such as the copper Bersetki statue, shows mastery of the lost wax method, an advanced technique allowing for intricate detail and lifelike forms. Seals functioned as both administrative tools and symbolic statements, communicating ownership, authority, and devotion, while temple art served as a constant reminder of divine presence, impressing both ordinary citizens and visiting dignitaries. Inscriptions accompanying these works frequently combined narrative with invocation, creating multi-layered messages that were both documentation and ritual, a fusion of practicality, propaganda, and piety. As you imagine running your fingers across the carved lines of a cylinder seal or standing before a towering stele, you can sense the meticulous care, the deliberate intention to awe and instruct. Yet, in these frozen images, a subtle question lingers. Are we witnessing the true spirit of the Akkadians, or the idealized vision they wished to leave for eternity? At the core of Akkadian civilization, the boundary between mortal and divine was thin, a shimmering veil where the presence of gods permeated every aspect of daily life. From governance to agriculture, from warfare to artistic expression, the kings of Akkad were not simply rulers. They were regarded as living intermediaries of the gods, elevated to divinity while still among their people. Their likenesses deliberately exaggerated in scale to convey both authority and sacred power. Naram-Sin, for instance, appears in monumental carvings ascending mountains, adorned with horned helmets, leading armies over the bodies of fallen foes, striking portrayal of his dual nature as both king and god. Temples and ziggurats functioned as hubs of ritual, wealth, and administration, where priests and priestesses not only conducted spiritual ceremonies but also oversaw irrigation systems, collected tribute, and acted as mediators between the human and divine realms. Enheduanna, Sargon's daughter, embodies this fusion of power and piety. Her hymns were more than devotion, they served as instruments of political authority, bolstering her father's rule while asserting her own position as high priestess. Deities such as Inannostar, Enlil, Ea, and Shamash dominated religious imagination, each representing forces of love, war, justice, and wisdom. Their images recurring across seals, steles, and statues, a constant reminder to the population of the gods' omnipresence. Rituals were elaborate, often involving offerings of food, incense, and precious metals, and in some cases, human or animal sacrifice, reflecting the gravity of seeking divine favor in a world of unpredictable floods, droughts, and warfare. Scholars suggest that Akkadian religious practices often intersected with political strategy, with gods legitimizing kings and kings maintaining temples, forming a cycle that reinforced authority. Others argue for a more mystical reading, proposing that these rituals were genuine attempts to navigate a cosmos both ordered and chaotic, reflecting their understanding of the balance between mortal and divine forces. Sacred inscriptions, etched on steles or cylinder seals, directly linked kings to the gods, framing victories as divinely sanctioned and failures or famine as signs of displeasure or neglect. Even daily life bore divine marks. Household items, clothing, and tools frequently featured symbols invoking protection and blessing, integrating the sacred into the mundane. Yet despite the seeming omnipotence of gods and their earthly representatives, the Akkadian Empire ultimately fell, leaving behind these potent images as echoes of a civilization whose faith and authority were inseparable but could not halt the relentless march of time. These ancient rituals then pose a profound question. What do they reveal about the fragility of power and humanity's enduring desire to reach the divine? Akkadian art was far more than decorative. It functioned as a deliberate and potent narrative language, used to assert dominance, convey ideology, and immortalize rulers and their deeds. From the monumental steles, like the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, to the intricate cylinder seals, illustrating mythological and everyday scenes. Each artifact communicated messages of authority, fear, and divine sanction. Soldiers towered over conquered foes, kings traversed mountains and rivers, and gods loomed large, their presence intertwining earthly and celestial domains. The realism achieved in sculpture and relief was remarkable, with detailed musculature, expressive faces, and dynamic postures conveying movement, emotion, and intent. Cylinder seals, often no larger than a thumb, encapsulated entire narratives, heroic feats of gods wrestling beasts, humans interacting with divine entities, or ritual ceremonies compressed into miniature epics, rolled onto clay to leave lasting impressions. These objects were ideological tools as well as art, reinforcing sacred and political order. The Besetki statue and other works in copper or bronze demonstrate mastery of metallurgy, including the lost wax casting technique, revealing the deep interconnection between technological innovation and artistic expression. Art also served a ritual purpose. Statues and steles were not inert, but active participants in the worship of gods and the legitimization of kings, placed in temples, palaces, or public spaces to command attention, respect, and obedience, ensuring the king's presence was felt even in his absence. Scholars argue that the intense depictions of war and divine authority reflect the precariousness of Akkadian life, where natural disasters, famine, and conflict loomed perpetually, and art became a mechanism for imposing order upon an unpredictable world. Some seals depict agricultural labor, emphasizing the centrality of food production and trade, while others convey mythological narratives intertwining morality, divine justice, and human behavior. The sophistication and scale of Akkadian visual culture suggest that literacy extended beyond cuneiform. The population could read images, interpreting embedded codes of power, spirituality, and social structure. As we study these artifacts today, the precision and intention behind each line, curve, and figure becomes evident. Each element selected to communicate, intimidate, instruct, and awe. And yet, despite their exacting craftsmanship and commanding presence, these works could not prevent the empire's decline, prompting reflection on how a civilization that mastered both visual and written communication to shape perception ultimately fell silent. What secrets lie frozen within these narratives, waiting to reveal the lives, fears, and ambitions of the Akkadians, and the fleeting nature of empire? Though the Akkadian Empire endured barely 2 centuries, its influence reverberated across history for millennia, leaving traces in Mesopotamia's political structures, languages, and cultural memory long after its collapse. The notion of kings ruling from sunrise to sunset and claiming dominion over the 4 quarters of the earth would echo in later empires, establishing a model of centralized authority and divine legitimization. Even as the Gutians, Amorites, and subsequent dynasties rose and fell, memories of Akkad's conquests, administrative innovations, and religious practices endured, serving as both cautionary tale and aspirational example. Linguistically, Akkadian, once the language of rulers, scribes, and priests, continued to shape regional languages, influencing Babylonian and Assyrian dialects for centuries. Sumerian, though fading as a spoken tongue, persisted in literary and sacred contexts, preserving Akkadian texts alongside its own and ensuring the transmission of Akkadian myths, legal codes, and intellectual traditions. Culturally, advancements in art, and monumental architecture left an indelible mark. The realistic depictions of kings, soldiers, and gods informed subsequent Mesopotamian iconography, where size, posture, and context conveyed power, divinity, and narrative. Administrative strategies pioneered under Sargon and Naram-Sin, including provincial governance, temple oversight, and placement of heirs in strategic roles, became templates for empire management across the ancient Near East, demonstrating how centralized control could coexist with localized authority. Stories of Akkadian rulers, Sargon, the visionary conqueror, Naram-Sin, the god-king, and Enheduanna, the poet-priestess, entered myth and literature, embodying lessons of ambition, hubris, and the interplay between mortal and divine power. Modern archaeology, through sites like Tel Leland and Tel Brock, reveals sophisticated urban planning, irrigation systems, and trade networks, underscoring a civilization adept at navigating environmental and political challenges. Yet despite such sophistication, Akkad could not withstand the combined forces of climate shifts, internal rebellion, and external invasions, a sobering reminder that even the most advanced societies are vulnerable to nature's relentless rhythms and the unpredictability of human ambition. Looking across millennia, Akkad emerges not merely as a historical chapter, but as a testament to ingenuity, ambition, and the allure of power, inviting us to ponder what lessons linger within the ruins of an empire that dared to ascend to the heavens, only to dissolve into the shifting sands, leaving behind secrets that still whisper across time.